In the last video, we talked about subsequent measurement related to lower of cost or net realizable value. That's a procedure performed by companies who use FIFO or weighted average costing. Companies who use LIFO have to perform lower of cost or market instead. So let's take a look at what lower of cost or market looks like. Under LIFO, in our example, we had ending inventory that had a value of $19.05. And that was for the 12 units of cantaloupe that we had remaining. In order to determine whether or not our inventory items have lost value, or the value has dropped below our original cost, we have to perform a procedure. That procedure is called lower of cost or market, or what we call LCM. Cost is pretty easy to determine. We already know what the cost is. The cost is $19.05. What we need to determine is the market. And so when we do the market value calculation, we have three things that we have to figure out first. We have to figure out the net realizable value. That is the same process that we figured out in the last video. Net realizable value, estimated selling price, minus estimated selling costs. When we do that, that value that we calculate, that becomes our ceiling. And so we will not report a market value higher than that number. Then we have to calculate the net realizable value less our typical profit margin. Okay. This value becomes our floor. So we have a ceiling, which means we will not put a market value higher than net realizable value. And we have a floor, which means we will not put a market value lower than net realizable value less our typical profit margin. The third item that we want to figure out, though, is what's called replacement cost. And that's basically what it says. What would it cost us to replace the items that we have currently? What is the current price in the market in which we purchase these cantaloupe? So we're going to look at a couple of examples here and see if we can't figure this out. We're going to follow similar to what we just did in the previous video with lower of cost or net realizable value, calculating net realizable value. So in our first example, our estimated selling price was $3.80, and the estimated selling costs were 75 cents. And so we had a net realizable value per unit of $3.05. And times 12, since that's how many units we have, right, we would figure that out. Now, the floor, well, if we have a net realizable value of $3.05, we need to know what our typical profit is on the items. So let's say that our typical profit on the items is $2, which means my net realizable value less my profit would be $1.05. So that's my floor and that's my ceiling. The next thing I do is I figure out what is my replacement cost. What would it cost me to replace the items that I would want to replace right now? What does it cost? In the market in which I buy cantaloupe, what does it cost to buy the cantaloupe? So let's say that our market value currently, the replacement cost, is $2. Okay, $2 per unit. Now I have a floor and a ceiling, and I have a replacement cost. If my replacement cost is between the ceiling and the floor, then I'm going to use my replacement cost as my market value. In this case, that's what we have. So my market value, the one I'm going to use to compare, is this $2 per unit value. And so I'm going to take that number times my 12 units, which means I have a market value of $24. So that is my market. Sometimes what we call the designated market value. So again, I've got to compare my cost and my market. Okay. So when I come down here to do my comparison, I'm going to say I need to find the lower. See if I can erase that. Okay. I need to find the lower of cost or market. That is going to go on my balance sheet. And so my cost is, my cost in our example here is $19.05. And my market is 24. 24 was the replacement cost. It was below the ceiling and the floor, above the floor, below the ceiling, and that's my value. So which one is going to go on my balance sheet? Which one is the lower? Well, in this case, let's see if we can fix that mess. Okay, which one is the lower? It is our cost. And so when we go to put the balance sheet together, we don't really have to do anything. Our balance sheet number is going to be the 1905. And if we were to look at our T account for inventory, that's what's in there, is 1905. So we don't really have to do anything in this scenario, in this example. Okay. Let's take a look at an example, though, where we might have to do something. So let's take a look at a second example. Okay. Still getting used to this marker thing. All right. So we're going to establish our ceiling. What is our net realizable value? So in this scenario, this example, our estimated selling price went down to $1.90. Again, we said we don't really know why. People aren't buying cantaloupe, but that's all we're going to be able to sell them for. So if that's the case, and we still have the 75-cent selling costs, our net realizable value is $1.15. And as we said before, right, that is our ceiling. Okay. Then we need to determine the floor. Well, if $1.15 is our estimated selling price and our normal profit margin is $2, then we have a loss here of 85 cents. And so that's our floor, which is below zero, so we wouldn't be going there anyway, most likely. So the next item is replacement cost. So we need to say, well, where does replacement cost land here? If our replacement cost is $2, where is it? Try to fit it up here. If our replacement cost is $2, then we see here that it is above the ceiling, right? It is higher than the ceiling value. And so we're not going to use replacement cost as our market value. We are going to use the net realizable value. So $1.15 net realizable value, 12 units. What do we get for a net realizable value? we should get $13.80. So when we go to do our comparison, right, let's do it over here. When we're looking at the lower of cost or market, our cost is $19.05, and the market value we just calculated is $13.80. And so when we go to do our analysis, what are we going to use? What is going to end up on our balance sheet? Well, we're going to have to write down our inventory to the new value. So this is going to go on the balance sheet, $13.80. Now, like before, with lower of cost or net realizable value, we have a problem. What's our problem? Well, the inventory account has $19.05 in it. So the easy way to fix it, not always the best way and not always the way companies would use, but the simplest way to go through this process is to reduce our inventory. And so what do we need to do? Well, we have a difference between $19.05 and $13.80, and our entry needs to be then for $5.25. So I'm going to go into my books and I'm going to record a write down of my inventory. And so the write down I'm going to make, the journal entry I'm going to make, is cost of goods sold for $5.25 and a credit to inventory for $5.25. When I make that entry in my books, I have a credit to inventory for $5.25 that gets posted. I now have a balance in inventory of $13.80, which is the lower of cost or market value. Now, that's a more complicated process. It has more steps involved. And that's one of the reasons that FASB has transitioned to lower of cost or net realizable value for FIFO and weighted average companies. Again, LIFO companies, it's a little bit more complicated than that for them to make the change, and so they haven't done that. I want to take a minute to go back and look at what Under Armour says about their inventory valuation. We read this before in the previous video, but here under valuation and reserves, it says we value our inventory at standard cost, which approximates landed cost using the first in first out method of cost determination. So it's a FIFO company. So it is a FIFO company. They should be using net lower of cost or net realizable value. And so it goes on and says, net realizable value is estimated based upon assumptions made about the future demand and retail market conditions. So again, they're trying to figure out what they can sell it for, what the selling costs are, things like that. If we determine that the estimated net realizable value of our inventory is less than the carrying value of such inventory, which is the process we just went through in these two videos, right? We record a charge to cost of goods sold to reflect the lower of cost or net realizable value. So they make that entry that we just went through to record the fact that their items have lost value. If actual market conditions are less favorable than those we projected, further adjustments may be required that would increase the cost of goods sold in the period when such a determination was made. So they're a FIFO company. They apply the FIFO cost flow assumption, and then after that, subsequent to that, they apply the lower of cost or net realizable value procedures. Now again, we do this all in the aim of ensuring that we do not overstate the value of our assets. We do not want to put values on our balance sheet for assets that are greater than the value we think they will produce for us in the end.